In the frozen dark of a Nazi labor camp, 300 starving prisoners realized no rescue was coming. Surrounded, disarmed, and beaten down, they made a decision the Germans never expected, an uprising so bold, so desperate, that the Reich tried to erase it from history. In the winter of 1944, as the Third Reich bled manpower on every front, German authorities expanded and militarized dozens of forced labor camps scattered across Silesia and the general government. This camp, one of many satellite sites feeding the wartime factories, was never meant to be remembered. It had no grand gate, no famous commandant, just rows of frostbitten barracks, the stench of coal dust, and a perimeter of rusting barbed wire that hummed in the wind like a living thing. Inside those wooden barracks lay men who had been starved past fear. Daily rations rarely exceeded 1,000 calories, thin soup, crusts of bread, sometimes nothing at all when transports failed. Prisoners slept on straw sacks blackened by lice, their breath freezing into thin white layers on the plank walls. The cold wasn't merely discomfort, it was a weapon. Many woke with limbs numb from the night air and knew that frostbite was sometimes punished as self-mutilation. Each morning, guards drove them toward the factories and mines with rifle butts and shouted commands. Soviet POWs stripped of Geneva protections, Polish political prisoners marked with red triangles, Yugoslav partisans, French mechanics captured in reprisals, and Jews who attempted to hide their identities beneath borrowed papers. In the late war chaos, these categories often blurred. Records were incomplete, units improvised, and entire transports were reclassified to meet labor demands. By 1944, the camp's atmosphere had changed. German desperation was visible everywhere. Older Volkssturm recruits appeared among the guards. Teenagers in oversized uniforms stood watch beside veterans who had been sent here to recover from Eastern Front wounds. Rumors spread that entire Wehrmacht battalions had been swallowed near the Vistula, and that Soviet armored spearheads were pushing west faster than anyone expected. That desperation made the guards volatile. Some clung to rigid discipline. Others, sensing the end, grew careless. Roll calls shortened. Inspections became rushed. Ammunition was rationed. Even the dogs, once the camp's most feared instruments, were fewer now. Many transferred to larger facilities deemed more critical to the war effort. And yet, in this thinning structure, an idea took root. It began in the dim corner of Barrack 6, whispered in a dozen accents, men who shared no common language but understood survival. A Soviet sergeant, captured outside Kharkov and reduced to half his body weight. A Polish underground courier who had survived 2 prior camps. A French factory specialist forced to repair German machinery under guard. None of them were leaders by choice. They were leaders because no one else was left. The whisper was simple: this place is weaker than it looks. A guard walked past the barrack window, boots crunching on frozen mud, hearing nothing. But inside, the spark had already landed, small, invisible, and impossible to extinguish. The revolt had not begun, but its first breath had. By 1944, the camp's purpose was no longer just exploitation. It had become a system refined to erase identity itself. Every prisoner who stumbled through its gates joined a catalogue of numbers meticulously recorded by the Schutzhaftlagerführer and the Labour Office. Cloth triangles, red for politicals, yellow for Jews, blue for foreign laborists, green for criminal charges, were stitched to thin uniforms so worn that frost slipped easily through the fabric. To the guards, men were not Soviets, Poles, or French anymore. They were Arbeitskräfte, labour units, assigned by number to mines, repair shops, and construction trenches around the camp's perimeter. Roll calls, Apple, were the most ruthless demonstration of that system. Prisoners stood for hours on the gravel square, whether in the icy dark of January or under driving rain, forced to hold formation while clerks counted and recounted rows that never quite aligned. Anyone who collapsed during these sessions was dragged forward and beaten. Sometimes their bodies were left lying in the mud until evening, serving as warnings of what discipline required in the Reich's final year. But the machinery of control was beginning to strain. Across the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht's losses had entered entire garrisons. Divisions like the 4th Panzer Army, fighting to halt the Soviet Vistula offensives, consumed manpower at an unsustainable rate. Berlin responded by pulling hundreds of trained guards from smaller labor camps and throwing them into collapsing front lines. What remained behind were older reservists, convalescent soldiers recovering from wounds, and teenage Volkssturm auxiliaries whose hands shook on their rifles. As guard numbers dropped, brutality rose. In early 1945, Heinrich Himmler issued directives warning camp commanders that disloyal elements might attempt uprisings as the front drew closer. Several camps, most notoriously Janowska and Blechhammer, carried out mass executions during evacuations, killing prisoners rather than allowing them to fall into Allied hands. Rumors of these liquidation orders seeped into every barrack, carried by new arrivals who had survived forced marches only to collapse here. Tension thickened like the smoke drifting from the factory chimneys. The catalyst came in the form of punishment, a public killing staged on the Appellplatz. A prisoner accused of sabotage was hanged while forced labor crews were ordered to watch. Acts like these were documented across numerous camps as conditions deteriorated. They were meant to terrify. But terror produced something else, a silent calculation among men who had already lost everything. In the barracks that night, reactions varied. Some curled deeper into their straw bedding, whispering prayers or staring blankly at the ceiling beams. Others clenched their fists in helpless rage. A few muttered that escape was impossible, that the forest was lined with patrols and that anyone who fled without food or boots would collapse before dawn. But fear was no longer universal. With guard discipline fraying and patrol routes irregular, opportunities, small, fragile, and dangerous, began to appear. A Soviet prisoner retrieved a bent nail dropped near a workshop. A Polish inmate hid a broken wrench beneath floorboards. A French mechanic smuggled a length of wire from the factory where he repaired assembly belts. Individually, they were nothing. In the hands of men with nothing left to lose, they became tools. And tools could become weapons. Whispers passed quietly along the bunks, carrying a single, unspoken truth that settled coldly over the barrack. If we do nothing, we die anyway. It wasn't a plan yet. But it was the moment resignation finally began to crack. They began in darkness because darkness was the only place left to think. The camp was arranged to prevent thaw itself, locked barracks with single iron doors bolted from the outside, watchtowers spaced like punctuation along the perimeter, and in every tower and milligram 34 mounted on a pivot, its tripod eating up space and spitting lethal bursts at the smallest movement. Patrols cut the fields in jagged lines. Field telephones hummed through the compound and searchlights swung slow, patient arcs across frost. German shepherds, trained to track the scent of fear, padded along the fences at night. Daily searches were ritualized. Hands up, jackets off, boots emptied, bunk mattresses ripped open for contraband. Any scrap discovered meant beatings, cell time, execution. Against that architecture of control, planning looked like gambling with fingers tied. Information became the first weapon. Prisoners learned the cadence of the guards by listening. Shift changes followed timetables. Breakfast, a short cigarette break, a roll call that stretched. The milligram 34 crews rotated after long watches. The youngest conscripts nodded off at irregular hours. These details were not invented strategies but observed realities. Men counted steps between the barracks and the watchtowers, timed the click of telephone exchanges, and mapped the blind spots beneath floodlights. Concealment was primitive and ingenious. Metal scraps, bent nails, a cog from a broken lathe, a jagged washer, were hidden in boot soles or sewn into the hems of shirts. Small tools from repair shops and maintenance bays vanished into the mouths of the sick during labor details and reappeared under straw at night. Messages moved by coughs and taps. A cough at the second beat meant meat. 2 short taps on pipes meant standby. When words were dangerous, rhythm replaced them. Men memorized sequences, the cadence of a work whistle, the cadence of a messenger's footfall, and turned them into signals. They also learned to make what the camp denied, privacy. A mattress corner lifted for a whisper. A stack of crates behind a storage shed became a brief cathedral of conversation. Prisoners from different language groups taught each other the simplest phrases to pass along technical information. Tower, wire, shift. Where language failed, gestures and shared glances sufficed. Tactical thinking followed the logic of constraints. With no rifles and no explosives, their goals were limited and precise. Seize a watchtower, cut telephone and field telephone lines, neutralize the guard dogs, and take control of the army or workshops where German small arms parts were kept. The milligram 34's presence meant they could not charge the wire in daylight. Blocking the tower's field of fire for seconds, by throwing up stacks of barrels, tipping over a generator, or creating smoke from an oil fire set in a maintenance pit, might buy the time to reach a door key, bolt cutters, or the ammunition locker. They rehearsed contingency. If the tower fell, where would the rifles point next? If an alarm bell sounded, which shift routes would the reinforcements take? The French mechanics who had been forced to maintain assembly belts described the camp's electrical grid. A Polish courier remembered the path of supply wagons that made the rounds. A Soviet POW with experience in demolition explained how to loosen bolts without tools. None of these were names on a plan, only skills assembled like parts of a machine. Every act of preparation carried the knowledge of its price. Historical records of late war camps are full of executions after failed escapes and uprisings. Reprisals were immediate and ruthless. Prisoners knew that capture meant not just recapture but public death, sometimes whole barracks punished in response. Yet the calculus was grimly simple: remain and slowly starve, or risk everything for a moment that might free hundreds. Then orders arrived from the commandanta: prepare for relocation. In the winter of 1944-45, that benign administrative word had acquired a lethal definition: evacuation to the west, forced marches, or outright liquidation. The announcement tightened throats across the barracks. Watches were checked. Hidden caches were reburied. The plan, still fragile and incomplete, acquired a clock. Time was no longer theoretical. The revolt would either have to be set in motion, or it would be swept away under marching boots. The revolt did not begin with a shout. It began with silence. A low fog had rolled in from the fields that night, the kind that clung to the ground like smoke and made the watchtowers look as though they floated above the earth. The air was brittle with cold. Every boot step cracked the frozen mud like breaking glass. Guards paced their patrol routes wrapped in greatcoats, breath fogging into the beams of their lanterns. Fatigue showed in every gesture. After months of losses on the Eastern Front, many of these guards were reservists or convalescents pressed back into service, men who yawned their way through routines repeated too many times to feel dangerous. Inside the barracks, time stretched thin. Prisoners listened to the rhythm of the guard's steps, the mechanical whine of the milligram 34s being shifted for nighttime coverage, the distant growl of dogs sniffing along the fence. Then came the signal, a faint metallic tap, barely louder than a cough. It moved through the bunks like an electric current. The first spark was calculated, a staged fall outside the latrine. An injured prisoner sagged into the snowbank, gasping, drawing a guard from his post. As the guard bent to investigate, another figure emerged from the fog behind him. The struggle lasted seconds. The guard never cried out. Across the camp, synchronized movements erupted in the darkness. At the maintenance yard, prisoners armed with nothing more than metal scraps and timing lunged at the two guards stationed near the supply depot. In the chaos, a Soviet POW, once trained in frontline logistics, forced open the depot door. Inside were tools, fuel cans, wooden crates of hardware, and above all, the keys to the workshops where German rifles were serviced. It wasn't an army, but it was close enough. Near the western fence, a group of prisoners who had labored in construction crews used smuggled nails and wire cutters to sever the field telephone cables linking the towers. The lines sparked as they snapped. For the first time in months, the guards were isolated. Closer to the center, a machine gun position became the night's most brutal contest. A Polish inmate, weakened, starving, yet fueled by the desperation that came from weeks of relocation rumors, hurled himself at the nest just as the fog thickened. The milligram 34 swung, muzzle flashing once before jammed hands wrenched it off its mount. The gunner went down beneath a pile of bodies. Elsewhere, French mechanics and Yugoslav partisans set fires in grain storage sheds, using burning rags and stolen oil. The flames threw wild shadows across the compound, creating decoys that confused the remaining guards and drew them toward the wrong corners of the camp. Exploiting broken sightlines, prisoners sprinted for the workshop building where rifle parts were stored, hoping to assemble even a handful of usable weapons. In total, there were roughly 300 prisoners in the camp, men from across Europe, many barely able to stand. They hurled themselves against 50 to 70 armed guards, a ratio seen in several late war camp uprisings, and the imbalance made every second lethal. Searchlights swung erratically, slicing through the smoke as dogs barked, pulled in conflicting directions by flames, shadows, and the strange silence that followed each fallen guard. Within minutes, the camp transformed into two worlds, one burning, one deathly still. A watchtower smoldered at its base where prisoners had toppled fuel barrels. Barracks stood half-lit by fire, half-dark beneath the fog. Some guards fled toward the outer gate, others regrouped near the command hut, unsure whether they still held control or were already surrounded. By the time the gunfire tapered, no one could say with certainty who owned the ground beneath them, the guards clutching their rifles, or the prisoners who had turned the night itself into a weapon. The camp stood half burning, half silent. The uprising was no longer a plan. It was reality, and no one knew what would come next. For a moment, the night held its breath. Then the camp gates, battered, half broken by the revolt, gave way, and the prisoners poured into the open like a flood released from a shattered dam. Some clutched stolen rifles, others carried only tools, splintered boards, or nothing at all. Many were wounded, limping through smoke and frost with the last strength they had. Behind them, flames from the storage sheds climbed into the night sky, turning the fog red and gold. This was the moment that every uprising in the final months of the war feared and hoped for: escape. But escape was only the beginning. Outside the wire lay a landscape shaped by German military necessity. Fields of frozen earth stretched wide under the moonlight, broken only by tree lines, ditches, and the dark outlines of patrol roads built for the rapid movement of guards and supply trucks. In many camps across occupied Poland and eastern Germany, the surrounding land had been seeded with minefields to deter Soviet infiltration. Even where mines were not documented, the terrain was deadly in another way: open, flat, and exposed. Running across it meant gambling on darkness and distance. Still, they ran. Some groups sprinted immediately for the forest, relying on the fog to hide their silhouettes. Others spread out across the plains in scattered clusters, hoping to dilute pursuit. A handful stayed behind in the burning camp, dragging the injured from collapsing barracks and forcing open locked doors to free men who could not move without help. These choices, who fled, who carried, who remained, were not heroic speeches or prearranged plans. They were the raw decisions seen time and again in real camp escapes: instinct, loyalty, desperation. In the chaos, arguments flared. Should they split into small units or remain together? Was the forest safer, or the marshlands beyond the fields? Staying together meant strength, dividing meant stealth. Some refused to abandon weaker comrades. Others made the calculation forced on millions during the war. One life carried might mean 2 lives lost. German reaction came quickly. Searchlights from the surviving towers swept across the fields, catching movement only to lose it again in fog. Patrol trucks revved to life from the motorshed, engines coughing out exhaust as guards scrambled to mount milligram 34s in the truck beds. Dogs were unleashed, German shepherds trained for pursuit, their barks carrying across the plain long before their handlers arrived. Short firefights erupted in the dark. A patrol truck raced along the road, firing into shadows. Groups of escaping prisoners dove into drainage ditches or the icy remnants of irrigation canals. Some managed to return fire with captured rifles, creating bursts of noise that echoed across the countryside. Others were cut down before reaching cover, their bodies disappearing into the frost. Yet there were victories, small, fragile, but real. A patrol was forced to turn back when prisoners disabled its headlights with a lucky rifle shot. A dog team lost the trail near a stream, allowing a group to slip away. Another cluster reached a fallen section of the tree line where branches shielded them from view, buying precious minutes. By dawn, the camp behind them had become a scorched ruin. German reinforcements arrived from nearby garrisons, late, angry, and confused by the destruction. Smoke rose from the armory shed. A watchtower smoldered. Field telephone lines hung severed across the ground like veins cut open. But the prisoners who survived the night were already gone. Some moved deeper into the forest, following nothing but instinct. Others splintered across the plains, footprints vanishing under new snowfall. The Reich was burning on every front. And into that darkness, the escaped men disappeared, scattered, wounded, but free for the first time in years. The revolt had ended, but the war had not forgotten them. By dawn, the German command had realized the full scope of the breakout. Orders went out immediately from the local SS garrisons. Every surviving prisoner was to be tracked down. Snow covered the plains, the frozen earth a perfect canvas for footprints leading away from a camp. Mounted patrols, trucks, and motorized infantry fanned outward, following the evidence of desperate flight. The Luftwaffe contributed reconnaissance aircraft, and the Wehrmacht sent radio units to intercept any communications. Farmers and villagers near the camp were questioned, coerced into reporting unusual sightings. Posters warned that harboring escapees would bring reprisals not only on individuals, but on entire families. For the escapees, survival became a game of patience, ingenuity, and sheer luck. Some fled east, aiming for Soviet lines. Soviet infantry units, now pushing west in the winter of 1945 as part of the Vistula-Oder offensive, occasionally spotted ragged columns of men on snow-swept roads. Those who could signal their identity, armed only with improvised markers or tattered Red Army armbands, were sometimes taken in, fed, and marched back behind the advancing front. Others sought refuge in the countryside, hiding in barns, under hay, or in hollowed-out trenches abandoned by retreating German units. Some survived on raw potatoes dug from frozen fields, on stale bread scavenged from local farmsteads, or the occasional scrap left behind by retreating soldiers. Yet not all were lucky. Those recaptured faced brutal consequences. Historical records from camps like Blechhammer, Janowska, and Moldorf indicate that escapees were often executed on the spot or returned to the camp to face public beatings. Some were forced into labor details designed to punish and humiliate. The SS and Wehrmacht went to great lengths to suppress news of the uprising. Reports were downplayed or erased in official propaganda, labeled as minor disciplinary incidents to prevent inspiring other prisoners. Despite the scale of the manhunt, the survivors' ingenuity and determination proved resilient. Escapees dispersed into small groups, using knowledge of local terrain, snow patterns, and patrol rotations to slip past German lines. Resistance networks in Poland and Czechoslovakia absorbed many, providing temporary shelter, food, and guidance toward friendly forces. Others pushed westward into German-occupied territories still contested by advancing Soviet troops or awaiting liberation by Allied bombers surveying the roads from high above. By the time the snow melted and spring began to thaw the fields, a truth became undeniable. More prisoners had escaped than the Germans had ever admitted. Every document, every poster, every guarded ledger understated the success. Each survivor was living proof that even in the closing months of the Reich, the machinery of terror could be challenged, if only for a fleeting, impossible moment. Amid the ruins, the frozen fields, and the charred remnants of the camp, those who lived carried a quiet certainty. The human will, even under the most relevant uprising, had been extinguished in the snow and smoke, but its echoes were far too dangerous for the Reich to allow them to survive. Berlin's high command moved quickly. Reports were shredded, and any official mention of the revolt was buried in cryptic labor logs or erased entirely from camp records. Commanders who had overseen the escape, regardless of their culpability, were reassigned or quietly disciplined. Witnesses, prisoners and guards alike, were warned that speaking of the event could bring severe repercussions, not only for themselves, but for families back home. Propaganda documents labeled the camp as merely reorganized, omitting all reference to the chaos, the flames, or the fleeting taste of freedom. Even as the Reich crumbled on multiple fronts, this was not a matter of oversight. It was a deliberate act to control narrative. The Third Reich could tolerate millions under oppression, but it could not survive the notion that 300 prisoners had seized a moment of power, had defied authority, and had vanished into the winter night. After liberation, fragments of the story emerged slowly. Soviet investigators, tasked with reconstructing the network of forced labor camps in Silesia and occupied Poland, collected testimony from survivors who had made it back behind Red Army lines. Allied intelligence teams, combing through German military dispatches and captured paperwork, discovered coded references to unusual losses, missing laboris, and disrupted factories. Small, burned fragments of camp records survived in barracks and warehouses. Each piece told part of a story. 300 prisoners had risen in the dead of winter, about 50 to 70 guards had been overpowered, dozens killed in the revolt itself, and more executed during the manhunt that followed. Yet the precise count remained elusive. Cold War politics layered another veil of obscurity. Areas liberated by the Soviets became part of the Eastern Bloc, and access to survivor testimonies was limited. Western historians, often dependent on incomplete German archives or second-hand reports, encountered gaps and contradictions. Many escapes, uprisings, and acts of defiance remained footnotes in broader studies of the Holocaust and forced labor systems, buried beneath the broader narratives of frontline campaigns and Nazi atrocities. Despite this, the numbers that could be pieced together are staggering in their implication. Several dozen perished during the breakout. Many more were hunted down and executed in the following days. Yet more than 100 survived, integrating into resistance networks or reaching advancing Soviet or Allied lines to live to liberation. This revolt, once hidden under layers of destruction and propaganda, was not an anomaly. Across occupied Europe, desperate, unrecorded acts of defiance flickered like sparks. Prisoners sabotaging trains, laborious burning factories, individuals slipping past barbed wire in the dead of night. The revolt at this frozen Silesian camp was part of that larger pattern. Quiet courage refusing to die, even in a world calculated to erase it. If history had not stumbled upon the fragments, the bravery of 300 forgotten prisoners might have vanished completely. And with it, one of the last, unspoken reminders that even under the most oppressive regimes, the human will can ignite, endure, and survive. Endless oppression could endure, adapt, and ultimately, defy the odds. The uprising at this frozen Silesian camp was not merely an act of desperation, it was a revelation of human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. Starved, unarmed, and watched by the most ruthless machinery of the Reich, hundreds of men seized a single night of agency and transformed it into a fleeting, yet profound, triumph. Their revolt illuminates a broader truth about World War II. Even in the darkest corners of oppression, the human spirit could ignite resistance. Across occupied Europe, similar acts unfolded daily, often unrecorded. Soviet POWs dug tunnels beneath barbed wire, Poles sabotaged forced labor factories, Yugoslav and Italian partisans struck trains and supply lines, and French and Dutch laborists silently destroyed machinery vital to the German war effort. These were not coordinated campaigns on the scale of frontline battles, but microcosms of defiance that cumulatively undermined the Reich's war machine. Each uprising, each sabotage, each escape reflected an elemental principle. People under oppression will seek to reclaim their humanity, even when the cost is life itself. Historians today reconstruct these events with painstaking care. Survivor testimony forms the backbone of understanding, piecing together the rhythms of the revolt, the tactics employed, and the human decisions made under impossible pressure. Archival fragments, burned or scattered camp documents, officer reports, railway logs, and ration records offer corroboration, while forensic studies of former campsites reveal the physical reality: burned barracks, displaced wiring, and foundations of makeshift barricades. Together, these threads allow a glimpse into a story that the Reich tried to erase. The uprising also provides insight into the moral calculus of survival. Prisoners were forced to make instantaneous, life-or-death decisions: who could flee, who needed to be carried, which path offered the best chance of reaching the forest, and which actions would protect the many over the few. Each choice, recorded in fragments of testimony, speaks not only to courage, but to solidarity and strategic thinking under extreme duress. Such decisions echo the experiences of resistance movements elsewhere: guerrilla fighters in the forests of Belarus, partisans in Yugoslavia, and laborists across the Reich who risked death for the possibility of freedom. In the end, the revolt was more than a fleeting victory. It proved that courage is not measured by strength or resources, but by the resolve to act despite insurmountable odds. The camp, once a symbol of degradation, became a crucible where ordinary men, Soviets, Poles, French, and Yugoslavs, asserted their agency, even if only for a single night. The consequences rippled far beyond the barbed wire. Hundreds survived that might otherwise have been executed, and the story endured through witnesses and archives to inspire generations. History often obscures such moments, but their significance is undeniable. In the architecture of war, where empires rise and fall, it is these acts of defiance that reveal the enduring core of humanity. One night, in a camp built to erase identity and crush the will, hundreds of prisoners refused to be extinguished. Their courage forced the world to bear witness. In the darkest winter of the war, 300 prisoners refused to die quietly, and forced the world to remember them.